Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about the power of color and how it can be used to really create some interesting portraits. When I use color in my portraits, I definitely use it in a very unique way, and there's hundreds, thousands of different ways that you can create a fun dynamic with your color in your portrait. Now, for this painting, I decided I wanted to go with some very subtle greens, but then on the next following layer, I wanted to increase that intensity. I wanted to have two sort of different levels of intense greens in this painting. Now, there's a lot of other things that are happening, especially in this first portion of the painting. I'm doing my usual block-in stage where I have the colors mixed to my palette. There's some cooler greens in the dark areas. The mid-tone greens are very earthy, and then they get a little bit more yellow towards the brighter areas, and that's all I'm really focusing on for this first layer, keeping things very simple, because I know in the later stages I'm going to intensify those greens and create more color variety, but at the same time keeping the colors in that sort of green spectrum. Of course, you gotta make sure that you have a good composition, and that's what I'm working on now, is just getting the tonal composition to look a certain way, getting it sort of cropped the same way as my reference image. But I'm also thinking about keeping those saturation levels very low key, not going overboard with them, so that when I do go into the next layer and I really intensify those greens, they really have a nice pop. One thing you might notice is when I get started painting, I don't do any initial sketching with a pencil or charcoal or anything like that. I like to do the drawing with my first layer of color. That way I'm sort of killing two birds with one stone. I definitely like to use the shape building method, where I'm looking at the face as a series of different shapes. And I talk about this quite a bit in a lot of my videos, but I feel like the way to approach a painting, if you don't want to have to deal with tracing and things like that, is to look at the portrait as a series of shapes. So not only am I getting my colors established on this first layer, I'm also getting my shapes established. This process can work really well if you just learn to get those general shapes figured out, know that you have them in roughly the right place, and just keep rendering them down, adjusting things and massaging things into place. You'll find that you'll get a fairly accurate portrait, and the more you do it, the more accurate you will become. One of the keys, though, especially if you're a beginner, is to make sure that you get a good grasp on color mixing and understanding how to mix your palette. Now, if you go to my Patreon account, I have a lot of tutorials where there's different color mixing practice sessions that will get you going in the right direction, and that is a big part of my tutorials, is giving people that ability, that confidence that they can mix any color. I feel like that's a very foundational thing that we all need to understand if you want to create a portrait that has very subtle, nuanced colors that aren't very saturated. Those are the harder colors to find. You could paint straight out of the tube, use the most intense colors right out of the tube as much as you want, but your paintings will more than likely not have a very good balance to them. And that's what every painting needs, is a good balance of intense colors and subtle colors. And there's so many different ways to do that. I have my own particular method. I always encourage the people that are using my tutorials to always search for their own method, their own voice that speaks to them as far as how much color they want to use. Maybe you just want to use black and white. Maybe you want to use just very earthy colors. Maybe you want to use the earthy colors with a mix of intense colors, sort of like I do. There are so many different variations of how much color that is saturated versus desaturated that it's very limitless. You're never going to really run out of ways to try different methods. It's really up to you to experiment and go through all the different colors out there, see which ones speak to you. And if you want to stick with just a handful of colors for a little bit, become an expert with those first, that's totally fine. Go through 10 different paintings using those same color concepts and see where it goes. There are tons of artists out there that I see doing this all the time where they go through sometimes hundreds of paintings using the same palette, but their paintings never get old because they find new methods to put those colors in different locations. And just by doing that, by moving the locations and amounts of those colors, you end up with completely different compositions that give a completely different feel to the final work. So as you can see with my painting, I am getting quite a bit closer to the end where I've put the amount of intense green about where I want it. And the levels of stronger saturated greens is telling the story that I want to tell with my paintings. And because the location is over the face itself, creating some abstraction in the actual portrait, that also creates its own unique story as well. If you don't like that idea of abstracting the face, if you want to do portraits that are very realistic or have an impressionist style consistently across the entire portrait, that's totally fine. What you could do is put some intense colors in the background, in the foreground, maybe just in the hair of the subject that you're painting. There's a lot of ways to keep the figure recognizable and still have some fun with color. The one thing I would definitely try to avoid though is trying to throw every single color imaginable that's intense into your portrait. Try to make one color the star of the show. There are ways to have multiple colors that are very intense in your painting, but the more colors that you add to your painting that are very strong, it's going to take a much higher level of control to make it work. So start simple, start with one strong color. Then after you've done a dozen or 100 paintings, whatever it is, wherever you start to feel comfortable, then you can start adding more and more color and start pushing the boundaries of what you can do. At this point with this painting, I'm basically getting to those last brush strokes. This is where I start to have fun with texture and maybe breaking out the palette knife for a few of the brush strokes and just trying to get those last sort of expressionistic style brush strokes put into the painting so that I feel like it's complete. I'm doing a lot of sitting back, staring at it from different distances, because when you look at these paintings from different distances, you get a different impression of what you're seeing. It's kind of like looking at it with a fresh pair of eyes. But that's really getting very close to the end. There's a few brush strokes left. Before this video ends though, I want to just quickly thank you for watching this video. If you do want to learn more about portrait painting, I do have a Patreon account. You'll find it in the link below. Every week I'm creating more tutorials to help my patrons in any way I can so that they can become better painters. If you want to see more of my videos, please subscribe. I do appreciate the support. And I will talk to you again next week.